To you live from Los Angeles. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the director of Hammer's public programs, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Conversation. Before we get started with the panel tonight, I have a few notes for the audience. This program is being conducted via Zoom webinar, and we'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and tell us where you're tuning in from. And the chat is also an area where you and the audience can all talk with each other. The Q&A box is where you type in questions you have specifically for the panelists. We're going to try and address as many questions as possible, but we have quite a large audience with us tonight, so we might not be able to get to everyone. Also, please note this program is being recorded, and the full video will be available later on the Hammer website. So on to tonight's program. I'm super excited. This program is really a perfect reflection of what we are trying to do here at the Hammer Museum. Our mission statement is that the Hammer Museum believes in the promise of art and ideas to illuminate our lives and build a more just world. And today we have three artists who use their work to explore some of the most important and urgent ideas of our times and translate them for a wide public. This all started with the wonderful Scott Z. Burns. He's a screenwriter, director, producer, and playwright. In the midst of the current COVID pandemic, he's surely most well known for writing Contagion, the must-see film of the year, which is an eerily prescient representation of the causes and effects of a global pandemic. And if you haven't seen it, as soon as tonight's program's over, you need to go watch it. It's incredible and it's very brilliant. His work in film also includes producing the Academy Award-winning documentary An Inconvenient Truth, as well as an Inconvenient sequel and Sea of Shadows. His writing credits include The Bourne Ultimatum, as well as The Informant, Side Effects, and The Laundromat. As a director, his credits include PU 239 and the Golden Globe-nominated film The Report, which received the Cinema for Peace Award for Best Political Film of 2019. Burns also directed the digital series The View from Here, a collection of documentary shorts on the terminally ill. On stage, his play The Library, which deals with a high school shooting, was produced at the Public Theater and was nominated for an Outer Critics Circle Award for Best New American Play. In television, he's currently developing an anthology series about the ramifications of climate change and the future of humanity for Apple TV, and that is called Extrapolations. He collaborated on an anti-elephant poaching film with Catherine Bigelow called Last Days, and he remains very active on issues concerning climate change, public health, and social justice. And he's an advisor at the Sundance Institute and a member of the National Resources Defense Council's Leadership Committee. So as you can see, he's an artist who really practices what he preaches and is literally addressing the most critical, urgent things happening in the world today and using his incredible skill as a writer to illuminate them for the rest of us. And so he put together this wonderful program tonight and invited two people whose work he really admires. And they're all going to talk about these issues of artists and their role in raising the alarm bells. Elizabeth Kolbert is a incredibly brilliant staff writer for The New Yorker. Her most recent book, The Sixth Extinction, received the Pulitzer Prize in 2015. She's a two-time National Magazine Award winner and has received a Heinz Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Academy's Communications Award. And she's now a visiting fellow at the Center for Environmental Studies at Williams College. Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta and grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied in Delhi, Oxford, and Alexandria, and is the author of The Circle of Reason, The Shadow Lines, In an Antique Land, Dancing in Cambodia, The Calcutta Chromosome, The Glass Palace, The Hungry Tide, and the Ibis trilogy, consisting of Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire, and his most recent book is called Gun Island. His nonfiction book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, was given the inaugural Utah Award for the Environmental Humanities in 2018. Ghosh's work has been translated into more than 30 languages, and he serves on the juries of the Locarno and Venice film festivals. His essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New Republic, and The New York Times, and have been anthologized under the titles The Imam and the Indian and Incendiary Circumstances. He holds 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards and 4 honorary doctorates. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest honors, by the President of India. In 2018, he was the first English language writer to receive the Jnanpith Award, which is India's highest literary honor. In 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the most important global thinkers of the preceding decade. So it's such an honor to have these three brilliant speakers and brilliant thinkers here to talk to us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Scott Burns, Amitav Ghosh, and Elizabeth Kolbert.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was really, really kind of you. Well, it's interesting. You know, one of the things I've learned from doing a few of these Zoom things now is being funny doesn't matter because nobody laughs. And maybe tonight's
You're laughing, Scott.
We're laughing.
Although I think one of the things that we have to figure out about tonight's topic is how to make it elicit all of the emotions and feelings that people can have about something. So I just want to kind of talk briefly about how we got here. And can you guys, if there's a way of bringing up that slide right now, that would be amazing. So this slide, this is an art installation by Andrea Bowers that I ran into a few years ago entering the Hammer Museum, where in a different non-pandemic time we might all be right now. I know it's hard to tell what that is on a slide, but if you were there, you would walk up to it and see the column on the right side. It's pretty much every major multinational bank, and the words on the left, the text on the left, are their involvement in everything from, you know, the pipeline at Standing Rock to other sort of energy initiatives. And it was really interesting to me because it was this moment where someone from a distance had made something that, you know, was a beautiful piece of art. And up close, it sort of told a story, and it began what for me has become a number of years obsession about how we tell better stories about climate change and why we haven't. As I started that, we can put the slide away. That was amazing that worked. Thank you. You know, a few years ago, after An Inconvenient Truth, I was invited to a book reading of Betsy's book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe. And I was lucky enough to get a signed copy and met her, and we've kept in touch. And I ran out and got the Sixth Extinction as soon as it came out. And I just want to read you all, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, the entire book. No, I'm not going to read the entire book. Just a paragraph that I have always found very inspiring. When the world changes faster than species can adapt, many fall out. This is the case whether the agent drops from the sky in a fiery streak or drives to work in a Honda. To argue that the current extinction event could be averted if people just cared more and were willing to make more sacrifices is not wrong, exactly. Still, it misses the point. It doesn't much matter whether people care or don't. What matters is that people change the world. This capacity predates modernity, though of course modernity is its fullest expression. Indeed, this capacity is probably indistinguishable from the qualities that made us human to begin with: our restlessness, our creativity, our ability to cooperate, to solve problems and complete complicated tasks. As soon as humans started using signs and symbols to represent the natural world, they pushed beyond the limits of that world. And that's going to be something, for me, that was a really inspiring moment to think about what we now describe as the Anthropocene. And Beth, do you want to just take a moment and tell people a little bit more about that book and where it came from?
Well, I'm glad you read that particular paragraph, which is really honestly the culmination of the whole book. And the book arose actually out of a book I wrote, a series of articles I wrote for the New Yorker, and a book which came out for better or worse, just as An Inconvenient Truth was hitting the movie theaters. and it was about climate change. The book was about climate change. And after that book came out, I started to, both as a journalist, people contact you and say you might be interested in this story or that story. And there were all these stories, it turned out, that were about, and this was really before the term Anthropocene had really entered the lexicon. It had been sort of put out there by a guy named Paul Crutzen, a Nobel Prize winning chemist, but it hadn't really filtered out into the culture at large. But I guess the whole thought was sort of percolating out there, and I wrote a couple of stories about other ways in which humanity is altering the Earth on what we would now really call it a planetary or geological scale. And as I sort of wended my way through that, so climate change is just one of the ways we're changing this planet on a whole planet scale. It led me to this idea, not my idea, in the scientific literature, but not really out there in the world, once again, of the sixth extinction, which is, very much, or the current mass extinction, or the Anthropocene extinction, whatever phrase you want to use to describe it, very much in the scientific literature, but trying to get that story, once again, we're talking about storytelling, get that story out of the pages of science and nature and sort of to a more general audience. And that's how that book came to be.
So Amitav, a couple of years ago, I began work on a project that I hope will turn into a series on Apple that is a scripted series that deals with the ramifications of climate change. And when I started doing my research for it, a playwright friend of mine in New York, the now Tony Award nominated Bess Wall, made me aware of the Great Derangement. And I just want to read a brief thing that Amitav had written. What is it about climate change that the mention of it should lead to banishment from the preserves of serious fiction? And what does this tell us about culture writ large and its patterns of evasion? In a substantially altered world where sea level rise has swallowed the Sundarbans and made cities such as Kolkata, New York, and Bangkok uninhabitable, when readers and museum goers turn to the art and literature of our time, will they not look first and most urgently for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? And when they fail to find them, what can they do other than to conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight? Quite possibly, then, this era, which so congratulates itself on its self-awareness, will come to be known as the time of the Great Derangement. And when I read that, I felt like I needed to meet you, and I'm thrilled that you're here with us tonight. Can you talk a little bit about the insights behind that?
Well, let me say, first of all, Scott, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I'd just like to say what an honor it is to be here with both of you. Contagion is just a marvelous film for our times. And An Inconvenient Truth was just such an eye-opener for all of us. And Elizabeth, your work has just been so inspiring for me. The Sixth Extinction is just really one of the greatest books of our time, I think, and so is Notes from a Catastrophe. So it's just such a pleasure to be here with both of you and with our audience. So, I became aware of climate change around about the turn of the millennium, really, because I was writing a book about the Sundarban, which is the world's largest mangrove forest in Bengal, which is where I'm from. And already then, the impacts of climate change were very clear. You could see that, saltwater intrusion, the increasing effects of hurricanes and cyclones, and so on. So that was when I started becoming interested in climate change. And then as the years went on, it became clearer and clearer that really the world was not paying attention to something that is so urgent, And what really struck me then is that, we as writers, as filmmakers, as artists of all kinds, we pride ourselves in a sense on being a kind of avant-garde, people who are ahead of the general state of knowledge of things. But in fact, I suddenly began to realize that we live in an even more heightened version of the delusion or derangement, if you like, than ordinary people. I mean, the people in the Sundarban are very aware of climate change. They know what's coming at them. Whereas if you go and speak to writers in urban India, they have no idea. I mean, their interests continue to be the interests of, urban middle classes everywhere, which is sort of like, issues of selfhood, identity, and so on and so forth. So all these meta issues that are really banging on our doors is, just escaping our attention. And I think it's very important to ask, why is this so? And there, we see a question at once about the word Anthropocene. This word, as you probably know, is very hotly disputed. There are many who would say that it's not an appropriate word because it's not all of humanity that has created this. It's in fact a very limited segment of humanity. I mean, today, the people of Bangladesh, in India, in Ethiopia, the average carbon footprint is about 1/50th of that of an American, and that's not even taking historic emissions into account. So behind all of this, there are very important questions of justice, of geopolitics, and so on. And I think all of these push us towards trying to turn our attention away from what is actually banging at our doors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that connects to sort of, to me, the beginning of this. And as someone who's been really, quite frankly, lucky to tell stories, in film and TV, I'm always told by people in environmental groups that it's on me, on us, the storytellers, to solve this problem. That they've put the science out there, but the science requires someone to put it into a story. I don't, and I guess I want both of you to react to that. I've been thinking about it a lot in anticipation of tonight. And, obviously my understanding, and probably a lot of people's understanding of the Vietnam War, was really shaped by a series of films that came out after the war. I mean, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, Coming Home, The Killing Fields. These were all films that really helped shape, a sort of, narrative about US involvement in Vietnam. And I guess that's Hollywood's contribution. A lot of people will say that European cinema after World War II really helped make sense of that experience. And obviously there were a lot of films that helped us understand the Holocaust. My concern always with that analogy is those things required the event to be over. We can't really wait till the event is over, because the event is ongoing. We're in the middle of it already. I'm just interested to hear what the two of you think about the state of storytelling around climate change.
Elizabeth, you go first.
Oh man. Well, I think that Scott's point about things being over and we look back on them points to, and really one of the huge issues with climate change, which is that it's not a discrete event. It's not even it doesn't have a story arc. It doesn't have a nice story arc, or if it does, we don't know what it is yet. And it's one that will play out, unfortunately, literally over millennia, So in some sense, we are just in the beginning of the story. So maybe that is one of the reasons why we haven't figured out, how to narrativize it, I guess, if that's a word. But the other thing I guess I would say is, all of those stories about the Vietnam War, about the Holocaust, about the World War II, they were always told, in some cases almost to comic effect, through, not comic, they're rarely comic, but almost ridiculous, right? Through one person, right? Saving Private Ryan, that's how we're going to tell, the story of D-Day is through one individual. And I think that one of the problems was telling the story of climate change, even from a journalistic point of view. And I guess I'm a little bit more sympathetic to journalists than most people, being one, is that it's very hard to say this exactly is climate change. I mean, it's becoming easier and easier, unfortunately. But for many years, you could call someone up, you would call up, your local expert on whatever, and they would say, well, I don't know. This is what you'd expect from climate change, but is this climate change? We just can't say. And so, as I say, as that story changes, I think the story of climate change will also change, is changing. But, what are the elements of a story? It's always got, characters, it's got a narrative arc, it's got a beginning, a middle, and end. These are all things that are really, really hard to impose on climate change in some way.
Amitav?
Elizabeth, am I wrong to think that you began as a writer of fiction?
Yes, I wish I were, but no, I've never written any successful fiction.
But you did do an MFA or something.
Nope.
No. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But look, let me say straight away that, I mean, if anyone has made wonderful narratives out of climate, the whole catastrophe that we're in, it's you. I mean, your stories are so compelling, and and that's where I think we have to stop thinking about this whole distinction between fiction and nonfiction, which is actually a very modern phenomenon. I mean, it came into being really only in the 20th century. I mean, if you look back on the work of Melville, I mean, he's always drawing on nonfiction. I mean, there's so much fact in Moby Dick. I mean, the whole chapter is devoted to fact, and many of his other books as well. Benito Sereno is founded on an autobiography of Amaro Delano. So I think that's one of the distinctions that we really have to let go of, structurally speaking. In this particular time that we're in, we have to try and find ways of bringing together fiction and nonfiction, and that's where I think journalists have done an amazing job. I mean, you have Rebecca Solnit, Jeff Goodall, and so many others have written wonderfully about this moment. And I think that can really carry us forward. But I think one of the problems really with turning this present predicament into compelling narratives is that, I mean, as you said, Scott, our scientist friends always telling us that, to make a story out of it. The problem really is the science. This entire thing has come to be framed in terms of science. And really, if you ask yourselves why that is the case, it's really because of a structure not of science, but of society, of, the geopolitical order. Everywhere I go in the world, ordinary people know the climate is changing. If you speak to farmers in India, if you speak to farmers in Indonesia, if you speak to fisher people, if you speak to women who have to walk miles and miles to fetch water, they've known about the climate changing for a very long time. Why do we not listen to them? We listen to the scientists. Why? Because that's the way our society is set up. And that is exactly what comes in the way of our telling these stories. The stories should be about the woman who has to walk farther and farther to fetch water for her family. The story should be about the fishermen. Indian fishermen are now being locked up. I mean, people from the east coast of India are being arrested in Iran. Why? Because they can't find any fish in their own waters. So they have to go farther and farther afield, and they stray into other people's territorial waters and are arrested. That is really the problem. I mean, the entire telling of the climate science story has become completely captive. I hate to say it, but it is the case. It has become completely captive to Western academic institutions. And this is a real problem. I mean, everything that is out there about climate change comes out of a Western university or a Western think tank. Yet the people who are experiencing this crisis in the most fundamental and visceral way are not people who belong to Western academic institutions. We have to find ways of listening to them. And that really is the problem. Those are the stories that we have to try and tell.
Yeah, I want to circle back for a minute to what you said about this, distinction between fiction and nonfiction, because it doesn't even start there. And you've written about this elsewhere, which is, when we deal with near future fiction writing, it suddenly turns into science fiction. It's in another part of the bookstore. It's not taken seriously or as seriously as literature by the majority of writers, and maybe that's unfair. I'm someone who loves science fiction, but even historically, that wasn't the case, was it? I mean, when people like Jules Verne were writing science fiction, I don't think the term science fiction really existed yet, did it?
No, the term didn't exist. But, it's an interesting thing. If you look back upon science fiction, the early beginnings of it and so on, it's a companion genre of colonialism. If the early utopian literature all comes to a peak in the 17th century, which is exactly when, the colonization of the Americas was underway. The whole trope of utopianism in European writing is really that of building a perfect society on an emptied land. And yet we know that none of these lands were empty, And that's the extraordinary thing. I mean, where they're creating these slave societies, they're imagining so-called utopias. I mean, it's actually kind of monstrous. Similarly, you think about all those narratives of replacement, H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds and so on. It's just an inversion of a colonial narrative, where he sees himself, or rather he sees England as a kind of inverted version of what happened in the Americas, So, but at the same time, even as I say that, I must say that, Hollywood has been, in my view, much more responsive to the climate crisis than literature has. I mean, really, till now, perhaps the most important work made on climate change is The Day After Tomorrow. And I've seen many climate scientists saying the same thing. It found a way of putting it together. And if you look at all the serials that are out there, my goodness, I mean, almost all of them are about climate change. So many, escaping the earth, so on and so forth. I mean, it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And you have so many major stars and directors, screenwriters, not least yourself, who are out there talking about these issues. I don't think that, the literary world has produced the same response.
Yeah, there's a climate scientist who I've worked with a little bit named Nicole Hernandez, who's in Florida and working with frontline communities. And she very much echoes what you just said, which is, I think the expression of climate change is something that people are experiencing already. And I have a friend who writes for Handmaid's Tale named Dorothy Fortenberry, who's a wonderful thinker on storytelling and environmentalism. And Dorothy says it's really easy to look outside and go, oh, well, there's no tsunami today, so there's no climate change today. And I think that we need to start as storytellers looking for climate change in all of these stories, because as you point out, they're happening to farmers and fisher people, and they're happening to frontline communities in coastal areas. And so these stories do exist. We fail sometimes to identify them and connect the dots for people. And in my experience, that's a big part of this problem. And again, it sort of requires somebody to connect the dots, to go from the kinds of work that Betsy does and uncovering these facts, and then finding people to populate stories that illustrate these experiences. And I do feel somewhat, The Day After Tomorrow, not my favorite movie. But I applaud the fact that someone tried to tell that story. What scares me sometimes is that we tend to cut to the end of the story. We tend to go all the way to the end of the road with Cormac McCarthy, and we don't stop anywhere along the way and look at what's happening now. We seem to want to go to the end, which is mostly dystopic. And I feel like there's better stories between here and the end that we need to find.
Well, can I turn this around? I want to ask you why. Would you say as a screenwriter that climate change is peculiarly challenging? Because obviously, a global pandemic, people would say, is also a pretty challenging thing to, capture in film, and yet you did that quite astonishingly, presciently, as was observed earlier. So is climate change any different? Does it pose different challenges? I don't really. I'm just wondering that.
I think a pandemic has a speed to it that makes it a little bit more urgent for people than maybe climate change. I think, the fact that climate change is a slow moving disaster movie makes it a little bit harder to pin down on the page. But again, I think, if you break off a piece of it and see what's happening certainly to frontline communities all over the world, or to animals, or the connection between the two, I think that that's a way to start understanding this. One of the things that, Betsy and I have been talking about, because I've been working on the Sixth Extinction as a possible kind of documentary series, is finding characters, because I think it is easier for people to go on the ride when there's a character for them to hook into. Certainly, Amitav's new book, Gun Island, I would assume that the first challenge for you was identifying a character for both of you.
Yes, finding a character certainly is, it isn't easy. It's hard to personify these things. But there again is the problem, really. We've grown so accustomed to a kind of completely human-centered way of telling these stories that is no longer possible to make a character out of, let's say, a storm. But again, Scott, I would say that, I don't think you're wrong in saying that climate change is a slow-moving disaster as opposed to a pandemic. But then let's remember that a storm like Hurricane Sandy happens very quickly. The wildfire in Paradise, California, it happened over 3 hours, killed how many people, destroyed entire ways of life. To me, what is incomprehensible to this day is that New York City, which is filled with artists and writers, hasn't produced a single Hurricane Sandy novel. It's produced novels about New York being drowned in the future. There's any number of those. But the reality of New York being drowned in real time, when people actually experienced this catastrophe, that doesn't figure in art at all. In literature, in art, so many artists, Chelsea, where so many artists are located, was one of the worst hit neighborhoods. Have you ever seen a major painting about Hurricane Sandy? I mean, how does this elude us?
Yeah, and yet going back to journalism, certainly if you haven't read the book Rising, it's a really wonderful way to learn about the human experience of these storms. Um, Betsy, within your work and the work that you're asked to do, how much of it is still driven by, you need to bring me a human character to tell the story, or to experience the story through?
Well, you always have to have human characters. I mean, I would say that, you don't have to have a character if you're doing a magazine piece. You don't have to have the same kind of narrative arc that you all do, that you have to have in a novel, for Amitav, or that you have to have in a film. You have people who populate it, who sort of are, illustrative in some way or representative in some way. But I thought Amitav made a really interesting and challenging point for journalists. When he said that the narrative is still driven by Western science, which is true, and certainly true of my own work, and that if we, got out there and just told the story more of, ordinary people dealing with these problems, a somewhat different narrative would emerge. And I think it's a very well taken point. I mean, we will still always kind of, at least those of us in the US, our editors will ask us, to run back to the scientists and say, well, is that really climate change? And so you do get into a little bit of a tangle in that sense. But I definitely think, and I also want to say on behalf of journalists, I think more and more people are out there tracing, migrations that are already being caused by climate change, I just finished Amitav's latest book on Island, which is a lot about people on the move, with climate change as a sort of thematic. And that's only going to be a bigger and bigger part of, and is driving, as the book also made clear, is driving a lot of our geopolitics now. And it's only going to become more and more of an issue, and a very, reorganizing. The world is going to be reorganized, geologically, and it's going to be reorganized geophysically. And we're not very good at change. Humans are not very good at change. We change the world, but we're not actually very, we're very loss averse. How's that? Loss aversion is a huge part of the human psyche, it turns out. So, the rising tensions, I mean, I certainly, I think a good movie could certainly be made about, these coming conflicts that we're gonna, unfortunately, I think, likely see.
Going back to Contagion, I mean, one of the things that I learned in doing my research for that, is that a lot of these pandemics are in fact climate driven and have a great deal to do with how we relate to nature. Even at the end of that film, there's a sequence where we see the jungle being cleared and a bat leaving its roost. And, with a lot of these viruses, and I think we will probably find out that it's true of the current coronavirus we're dealing with, these things make their way into the human population because of our incursions into wild spaces, and the fact that we have more people living in connection, or in, with borders, with jungles, with other wild places where they're going to encounter these things. And eventually the math will allow new viruses to jump into humans. Or when you even look at the way the world was settled, there are disease vectors that we didn't put huge population centers in. But as the mosquito band extends, and that mosquitoes live longer and longer seasons, we're gonna see more mosquito-borne illnesses, because of climate change and the fact that it's going to get hotter. And even the fires, we talk a lot about forest mismanagement, but a big part of this is that the bark beetle that used to die in the winter doesn't die because there's not enough winter. And so we have huge stands of dead trees that explode every time there's a fire. And the fact that we're building in places, again, where we didn't used to build. So I think a lot of these stories, especially pandemic stories, are in fact climate stories. And part of what I think we all need to do as artists is help people connect those dots so that they understand that this is a lot more than weather.
I think another challenge, and I'd be really interested in hearing what both of you have to say. I mean, is the question, and it comes up in both of your work. I mean, this question of sort of good guys and bad guys. Do we have a, as Amitav said, certainly, obviously, those of us in the U.S. contributed, way, way, way more than our fair share, and that goes back generations. But to a certain extent, we are all participating in climate change. We are all, helping to make it worse. Some of us much, much more vigorously than others, very much so. But, a pretty big section of the world population right now is working on this project, very diligently of putting CO2 up into the air. And a growing proportion of the world's population. And so, who's the sort of villain in this and who's the, victim is becoming even more complicated in a lot of ways. So that, I think, also poses, potentially, roadblocks for the kinds of narratives that we have, tended to see come out of Hollywood, let's say, though not necessarily for a literary, a novel. But I don't know if either of you feel like that is another sort of potential issue of why we haven't, seen the great, galvanizing, work. How's that? And maybe we haven't seen the great galvanizing work because people don't want to be galvanized. That's another issue there.
Amitav, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, look, at this point in time, it has to be said that, a middle-class person in India or China has a very large carbon footprint, not very much different from the average American or European. In fact, the largest carbon footprints in the world today are in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in Abu Dhabi, in the Arab Emirates, and so on. I mean, it's actually really shocking to see how large those carbon footprints are. And as you say, they're growing very fast. So yes, I do think the question of finding the villain is complicated, and it's not going to be a very easy question. But and I think you're right, Elizabeth. I think that certainly gets in the way of telling the stories. But at the same time, it has to be said that wonderful, amazing stories of this kind have been told in the past. I think of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I mean, to me, that really is a climate change novel before the fact, as it were. I mean, especially if you take the first chapter, the opening chapter of Grapes of Wrath. I mean, it's an absolutely magnificent. It's very short, but it's a magnificent statement on climate and humans. And again, it's a story completely about migrants. It's a really brilliant conceptualization of what was happening then. And then if you consider how Steinbeck was ridiculed and attacked by the American literary establishment, that again becomes kind of an interesting question, and which feeds into the present. I mean, Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, etc., absolutely despised Steinbeck. André Gide, for writing a good review of The Grapes of Wrath, he was completely shunned by Americans to the point where he gave up writing reviews. It's astonishing to think, I remember myself when I started writing The Great Derangement, my writer friends would say, why are you writing that? I mean, why are you writing about climate? Nobody writes about that. So, there are these entrenched kinds of, how shall I say, these attitudes within the arts and literary community that need to be dispensed with.
I completely agree. I think that, one of the issues, Betsy, that I feel we sometimes encounter, and it's unfortunate because I actually think it's an opportunity, is that the villain is frequently us, and our own proclivities, our own appetites. And it's very easy to get into a black and white world about good guys and bad guys. And I suspect that the best stories are stories where we take a good look at some of those things. I mean, I look back at, what China Syndrome and Silkwood did to wrong foot the nuclear industry. And that to me now seems a lot easier than something as convoluted as our relationship with fossil fuels and our relationship with consumerism and choice. I think that we sometimes shy away from those things instead of heading right at them, where I think there's a great deal of richness to be explored about, our relationship to the shit we buy and eat, and how we live our lives. I want to quote. Well, it's from the Great Derangement, Amitav, but I think it's such an important insight. So Bill McKibben wrote, "We live in a post-natural world, but did nature in this sense ever exist? Or was it rather the deification of the human that gave it an illusory apartness from ourselves? Now that non-human agencies have dispelled that illusion, we are confronted suddenly with a new task, that of finding other ways in which to imagine the unthinkable beings and events of this era." When you were saying earlier that, can a storm be a character? It's interesting to me because there are now places in the world where, a river can file a lawsuit, I believe, in New Zealand. And I do look at sort of colonial extractive economies and how that informed this apartness that you talk about. I'd love to hear you say more.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Look, to me, what is really inspiring in terms of art as well as in terms of experience and in terms of politics is the Native American experience. If you read Leslie Marmon Silko or Scott Momaday or any of the great Native American writers, they found ways of incorporating non-human presences. They found ways of writing about, non-human agency, because non-human agency is so much a part of Native American imagining, so much a part of Native American life. And this has, in fact, fed into their ability to create actually what is the single most important and most long-lasting American climate movement, which is the Standing Rock, no DAPL movement. These things are not disconnected. I mean, the no DAPL movement from the beginning was posited on the idea of defending all our relatives, And I think that's really where we have to turn. We have to take our inspiration now from people who have faced this kind of catastrophe and have managed to extract something from it, something important, some important ideas about how to tell stories and how to be in the world.
The other thing I wanted to ask you both about, because it's something that working in the industry that I do, I face frequently, is you find yourself pitching a story to an executive and at the end they go, "So, what's this story really about?" And I remember walking into Warner Brothers when we were trying to sell Contagion, and Steven Soderbergh looked at me before we went in and he said, "So do your pitch, but remember the last thing that you should say is, this is a story about hope." And I actually did it and managed to do it with a straight face. But I worry about how we use hope in the context of climate change. And, I remember hearing David Remnick interview Betsy on the New Yorker Radio Hour, where he affectionately called you Eeyore. So I know this is something that you wrestle with. And I don't know what to make of hope in the absence of a plan. I don't know where hope fits in to my experience of what's going on around me in the absence of leaders who are really willing to take, this shit seriously. And I worry about all of our stories needing to be hopeful. And what I've tried to do whenever I can is instead sort of look to, Viktor Frankl and go, okay, maybe it's less about hope per se, but about how someone behaves with human dignity and respect for each other and for the land around them in the face of huge odds. And isn't that as compelling as sort of saying you can't tell this story because, something goes extinct and you've got to give people hope? I would love to hear you guys think about where hope fits in with all of this. Betsy.
Well, this is the constant refrain of my journalistic career. And it even began, before I covered climate change, when I covered Albany politics. How's that, if you want a hopeless endeavor? But anyway, I was interviewing a very prominent scientist not a couple months ago, right before COVID hit, and he said, I don't know about you, but there's always a lot of pressure to have a happy ending, and I say, that's not my job. I'm a scientist, I don't do that. And that is, I want to say, kind of my attitude as a journalist. I don't do that. To use the terrible, I report, you decide, and is there hope at the end? That's your call. I rarely, just come out and, say, I don't think there's any hope here. There's always, we're a very hopeful species. That's why there's, 7.8 billion of us on planet Earth right now. So I don't think our problem on some level is lack of hope. It's lack of realism, of facing up to a situation where there's not a good ending here. There's degrees of bad endings, and we kind of have to grow up as a planet, as a society, as a global society, and say, look, our choices are not between everything coming, everyone joining hands and, some end of some, Coke commercial. It's between levels of badness, and let's face it, and let's get going so that we don't, we're not confronting the worst possible badness, which is sort of the trajectory that we're on right now.
Well, let me say, Elizabeth, that one of the things I really admire about your writing is that, you don't pander to those things. I mean, I felt that the last chapter of the Sixth Extinction, the last few pages, where you sound a kind of redemptory note, were imposed on you by your editor, more or less. Is that true?
No, it was not. They want to say my editors were very good. They took a hands off. It was the trope, really. It was the the demands of narrative. Let's put it that way. How's that?
Okay. Well, I must say that I think this whole sort of hope, despair narrative springs out of this mistaken idea of endless progress, which is actually at the bottom of the whole disaster, I think it's absolutely the wrong frame. I think the frame that we should see this in is the frame of duty. To do something about what we see in the world is our duty. It's our duty to ourselves, to our children, to our grandchildren, to those whom we don't know. It's our karma, it's our dharma. It should be that. It should be in a completely different frame from this modernist ideology of progress.
Yeah, I agree. And to be clear, and someone wrote a really great thought to me. So thank you who did that. I think that, yes, certainly hope can be a verb. And to me, again, I have a hard time as a storyteller separating hope from a character. And to me, my hope comes from the fact that we do know solutions, and there are people, whether it's Greta or Extinction Rebellion. There are people who have appeared now that weren't there 20 years ago when I became very involved in this issue. So yes, I see, I guess, hope in the fact that there are more and more allies coming into this. But again, to me, my inspiration comes from the behavior of people who stand up against really huge odds and try desperately to make a difference. Sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. I know that we're opening it up for questions, so please ask them. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to ask both of you one more question. Do you remember the story or the thing that happened to you when you realized that climate change, required you to tell stories about it, and that this was the issue of our time and you needed to engage? The specific story that found its way into your brain and you couldn't let go of?
Well, this reverts back to your previous question, but it's such a great line that I'll offer it. And it sort of began my, the first person who introduced me to climate change. I was introduced to climate change the way a lot of Americans were in the summer of 1988 when James Hansen went to Capitol Hill and testified at a very famous sort of moment in the history of climate change politics. And it was orchestrated, it was definitely orchestrated by people who wanted this story out. It was a very hot day in June of 1988, which was a very hot summer, would no longer count as a very hot summer. But anyway, when James Hansen, I heard him once asked, or maybe many times, what he says to people about hope or whatever. And he says, "I hope you're listening." And that struck me as a really good response.
I know I've read about your experience with the storm, and I love that story. So I don't know if that's the one you're going to tell, but I hope so.
No, actually, I mean, climate change, I wasn't alerted to climate change until much later, but it's a curious thing. Allen Ginsberg, who spent a lot of time in India, actually in my home city, Kolkata, in the 70s, he was talking about climate change way back in the 70s. I mean, even before James Hansen. It's kind of interesting. The ideas were out there, But for me, what's very striking is it was really Hurricane Sandy, I think, that brought home to me the urgency of it. Well, Katrina before that also, I suppose, but,
Hi. I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to just join the conversation. I will be bringing you audience questions. So I will be the avatar for the audience to read some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. But I'm going to take a little prerogative of asking the first question, which isn't even a question. It probably is more of a statement. But could you maybe talk about the role of just good old-fashioned racism in why people care less about these stories right now? Because as we all know, the frontline communities that are feeling this the most are usually Black and brown people around the equator especially. And I think that's part of why people in the United States, for example, don't care enough yet.
Well, I'll go first. Again, on my current project, I've been working with somebody in Florida, and that is exactly what she'll tell you, is that as sea level rise goes up in Miami, the people who are going to suffer the most quickly first are the frontline communities and are Black and brown people, and even the gentrification of the one hill really in Miami, I think is going to be something that really illustrates that story.
I think, what you're saying, Claudia, has a lot of truth to it. But at the same time, I don't think it's that simple a story. Because, for years, climate activists have told the story in this particular way, that the poor will suffer and the rich won't. I mean, clearly the rich who have like helicopters won't, because they can get out of the way of a major, climate event. But you look at the parts of the world that are worst affected right now. Where are they? I mean, Houston, look at what happened with Hurricane Harvey. Houston is the fourth largest city in America. It's the hub of the global oil industry. It was devastated. It's very clear Houston is not going to be habitable in some near future. Phoenix is already almost uninhabitable. Phoenix is one of the richest cities in America per capita. You look at California, where you are. It's increasingly clear that a time is coming when California is not going to be habitable in the same way that it is now. These are the richest parts of the world. You look at Southeast Australia, Victoria, where there have been these terrible wildfires. So, I just don't think it's that simple. Even you take Miami, who are actually the front line. It's all those millionaires and billionaires who are buying up a property that's absolutely on the seafront. And that's another sort of really puzzling thing. In these last 10 years, as the impacts of climate change have become more and more evident, the number of people moving to places like Phoenix and Miami is going up. The real estate markets are going up. So I think the derangement is much deeper than just that. I think it's in fact, in many ways, the wealthy and the middle class who are incapable of understanding what is happening in this world. They've been sold so much this narrative of progress, this narrative that technology will save you, that they are the most deluded of all.
Yeah. I think that Hail Mary pass fantasy has really set everything back. A lot of people think that, CO2 grabbing machines are going to save us, but okay. We have several people who mentioned the overstory. Do you want to talk about the overstory? Do you feel like that fits the bill?
I am going to admit that even though 2 people have given me that book, I have yet to read it. So I'm remiss. So I can't comment, but both of the people who gave it to me are people I really respect. So now for sure, I'm going to read it.
Well, I have to say, I think it's an absolutely wonderful book. And I think it's wonderful because he confronts the real challenge of, the real literary challenge of our time, which is how to give voice to the non-human. And he does that incredibly well. So it's a wonderful book. And I urge everyone to read it.
We have another comment from Vanessa Adele about other authors. She says, Barbara Kingsolver has written 2 climate change stories, Flight Behavior and Unsheltered. Jessamine Ward wrote about a family facing Hurricane Katrina in Salvage the Bones. And Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower is one of the first to speak about rising fires as a result of climate change in California. It's perplexing that these books have not been linked together, marketed, or collectively articulated as climate change-themed books. As you just discussed, there's so many issues and stories to talk about, from fires to hurricanes to migration of people, flora, and fauna, to settler colonialism and border politics. It seems that some of the issue is the sheer overwhelming number of disparate stories that are linked by climate change, and that we don't have a language yet for different kinds of climate experiences. What do you think about the distinction between building climate narratives and building climate vocabulary, which are also stand-ins for consciousness?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
I love all those books. What can I say? I think Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior is one of the great novels, Really, I just love that book, Octavia Butler's books. But I think there's one name missing there, which is Annie Proulx's Barkskins. Annie Proulx, I know for a fact, because we've talked about this, is she's completely obsessed with climate change. And in a way, I think Barkskins is actually, I would say in some way, even more ambitious than all these books, because it actually links environmental change back to the earliest years of colonialism, you know. It's a really monumental work, you know. Again, let me say, I think Jessamine Ward's book is also just amazingly powerful. So yes, the books are out there, and there are more and more of them. I mean, I get so many. I think 2018, really, when Overstory came out, was also a major inflection point, and now more and more writing is emerging along those lines.
Yeah, I guess I don't really know if we're better off having, you know, as someone called it the other day in front of me, cli-fi, as a category, or if we've really actually made progress when we've rid ourselves of that distinction, and that it's just literature, it's just stories, and that I worry that as we identify them as climate fiction, if they become almost like health food, rather than just food. And so, you know, that's, and I don't know the answer to it, but I'm very suspicious of sort of saying it goes over here rather than it is in fact the story of our time. And I hear you about the creation of language around it. And yes, we need to continue to work on that.
I completely agree with you, Scott. I think the whole cli-fi thing is just it's just a way of marginalizing what is actually our reality. And that's the great thing about Overstory. Overstory didn't get pushed into one of these generic, you know, margins. You know, it's about the reality of our times. That's what this is.
Athena Kildegard asks, is it possible that our expectations about what narrative does or can do simply does not accommodate global climate change? That is, narratives that end in romance or tragedy, in other words, dark alternative futures or feel-good false futures.
Eeyore, you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, I do think that gets back to a little bit what we were talking about, and once again, you know, not being a fiction writer, I'm not the best person to take this, but you know, just if you think of narratives requiring closure, you know, it gets back to a little bit what you were talking about, Scott. We know how that war ends, you know, we know what happened at the end. This is not having closure, you know, this is some person, some individual story obviously is going to have a narrative arc, but climate change, you know, the arc is very long, and I don't know what it bends towards, but it's really, really long. And that I think once again, from an outsider to fiction's perspective, I could see that as, if climate change is the subject, if it's really what's driving the narrative, the lack of an outcome, I could imagine as being a serious issue. But I'm going to punt that to you two.
You know, I have a theory that I'll go over really quickly, but you know, I think An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2005. And at the time, we always talked about things that were going to happen this century. And that meant we were basically saying the event horizon ended in another zero. And so 2100 was the finish line. And I think we have a problem with having 10 fingers and toes, that we tend to pay attention to things that end in zeros. And this isn't that issue. And I would love more than anything for someone to send me a study that tells me the event horizon for every different sort of individual person. And I think that's really the problem here. It's very easy for some people who can't afford to put food on the table next week to push off this issue, even though they may be the people most soon affected by it. And I think that to me is is the big mystery that I struggle with, is what is the event horizon for a person on this issue, depending on where they are in the world, what, what their socioeconomic circumstances are. And that to me, I guess, is the big variable, is how do we make this immediate for someone who may have the resources to push it off? I really feel like that was our biggest mistake in that film, is talking about things that would happen that century, which meant there was 95 years to kick it around.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is a related question that's sort of about positive Hollywood endings. Nicole says, we've heard a lot about the villains of climate change, and there's certainly no shortage of them. But how have you all dug into telling the stories of the heroes of the solution? Many include farmers transitioning their operations to regenerative agriculture, for example.
I'm gonna punt to you, Betsy, just because you have had to tackle this with people who are working on issues of extinction and other climate matters.
I mean, I do think that I guess I have to push back a little bit against the question. I do think that efforts to people who are making a difference. I think there's actually a bias towards that sort of narrative. For better or worse, there are a lot of people doing really great and important things on a local level, on a bigger, going out in concentric circles. But I think there's actually, if you looked at the coverage, you'd see not every, but a lot of ideas that are, just aren't going to pan out, haven't panned out, got a lot of coverage in their moment because they're like, this is what's going to save us, So I think there's, as a journalist, if someone comes to me with a story like, oh, this is what's going to save us, like I'm all over that, So I have often written stories, about people who are, absolutely on the front line, as you say, trying to save a species, which can be a last ditch effort, and sometimes beyond the last ditch. And I think those stories are really moving and really can be very inspiring, very depressing all at once. And so those are great stories. Those do count as really good stories. So I actually think that narrative is pushed in that direction, because those are the really good stories we have, the compelling characters, they care, they bring a lot of energy to the story.
We tried really hard to do that in Sea of Shadows, and I don't know if you've seen that film, but it did not work out well for the humans or for the vaquita in that story. I was incredibly moved by Biggest Little Farm when I saw it, and yet there's a part of me that wonders if that's scalable, and maybe it is, and it's I found that film incredibly inspiring from the standpoint of living with purpose, and so I do think there are those stories, but I think it's important that those stories, for me anyway, be held to the same standard of, it needs to be entertaining, it needs to have complicated characters and all of those other things. So yeah, we do need to tell those stories as well, but I think as Betsy points out, we need to certainly hold them up to the same kind of scrutiny.
So we have a lot of questions that have to do with storytelling, and I'm going to just throw another one in there and then maybe go to some of the different topics. But Steve Johns is basically saying, is it best to just tell it like it is? Is part of the problem with telling the climate change story the need or desire to resolve the issue? When a storyteller tries to resolve the story of climate change, does it only encourage the fiction of it all, that either we're all doomed or it's all going to be okay?
Amitav, do you want to tackle that?
Well, it's kind of It's kind of hard to say, really. I mean, really, the whole question of how do you tell something hopeful about this predicament is really it's really a non-starter because as Elizabeth was saying, I think it's very hard to know what lies ahead, and that's one of the most difficult things in the world today. We are living with this radical uncertainty, and that radical uncertainty affects everything. I mean, it affects storytelling.
And I also feel as a storyteller that it's not my obligation necessarily to solve the whole thing. I think, there are so many stories inside the bigger story that people can draw their own conclusions from. And there are parts of it that are easier and harder to solve. I mean, Betsy told me a great story earlier this summer about, a president going to Maine and opening up more water for lobster fishermen in an effort to get their votes, but now sending their boats into the migratory path of a whale. And, those are the stories that I think we need to really open up and look at from every angle.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of policy issues that have short-term gain and long-term disastrous consequences. And here's a policy-related question, and it also has to do with storytelling. Belinda Weymouth asks, isn't part of a story's impact dependent on the audience's receptivity? Case in point, after a screening of Mark Ruffalo's movie Dark Waters for 700 European Union lawmakers, they arrived at work the next morning ready to ban PFOA chemicals. Recent research shows that people don't want to change their individual behavior, but are more inclined to support policy changes that tackle climate change. Should we be telling more political stories and holding our elected officials' feet to the fire by showing what will happen to the world if politicians keep their heads buried in the sand and stay loyal to corporations and capitalism?
I'm going to go with yes.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that regardless of how you may feel about Al Gore, I think one of the things that Al certainly has said is that some of these problems really are difficult for an individual to solve, and we need leadership and we need politicians to make big policy changes. I mean, that's why, as flawed as Paris might be, without these shared big moves, we're not going to get there.
Marie Kennedy related question asks, this could be my question too. Can we even address the climate change crisis in a capitalist economy system?
Oh, come on.
I mean, that's a big question. We don't have an answer to that. We're going to find out. How's that? Or we're not going to find out. I think the question of, I think the question of which is harder to change our economy or to change our energy systems, our whole economic system, or to change our energy systems, I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. As I say, unfortunately, we're doing a big experiment right now. And right now it's not looking so good, but things can change fast. That's one of Al Gore's lines. I think it's from An Inconvenient Truth. Things can change pretty quick, momentum can build, and then politically a logjam can break. And we're gonna see, I guess, if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly a lot of people like Al who will claim that the free market system properly used will motivate people into these greener renewable energies and that will solve the problem. I honestly don't know if I believe that anymore. I don't know that I actually ever did, but as Elizabeth just pointed out, right now we have a choice. Do we change our political system, or do we try and use it to give us the result we need? And I think it's going to be very, very hard and very time consuming to change our political system.
Yes, I think you're right about that. But, climate change has been called the greatest market failure of all time. And I think to rely on capitalism to get us out of this is, mistaking the disease for the cure. But then what else do we have, as you rightly point out?
Yeah. All right. Well, I promised to release you all at around 6:30, so I'm going to just wrap up with a few final questions that are looking forward. First one is a fan note from Jennifer Cole to Amitav Ghosh. She loved Gun Island and wants to know if there's any plans for a film or television version.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. No plans so far.
Okay. And the next one is anyone dramatizing Exxon knowing that burning fossil fuels was heating up the planet? Will there be a movie like The Insider about Philip Morris knowing about tobacco? Because when the science and cover-up about cigarette smoking was revealed, smoking was no longer cool.
I will share this. I know that Nat Rich wrote a great story, I believe in the New York Times Magazine, and now has a book sort of all about that story. And it did make its rounds in Hollywood. I'm not exactly sure where it wound up, but I do believe that someone bought it at some point.
Okay. And Jay asks, we heard about Scott's next project, but could you talk about what Elizabeth and Amitav are considering in terms of future projects related to the climate crisis? And will there be any future collaborations?
Well, I'll take it. Or Amitav, I'll be very. I do have a book coming out in a couple months that is sort of tries to look at the question of where do we go from here? How's that? That's and then after that, what am I going to do? I don't know. Weep. I don't know. Depends what happens on November 3rd. How's that? I'm going to leave that one open.
Well, I actually have, the strange thing is, just as one says that in a moment of utter crisis, you can also find forms of resuscitation, as it were. I've actually had an incredibly sort of productive time over these last couple of years, including these last few months, and I have several projects coming out soon. January, in July, and I'm just, in fact, trying to finish a book this week, which is why I'm a little tired.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. I look forward to all of your new upcoming projects. And I have to say, you've given me a reading list and a watching list that will fill my next 6 months at least, and I'm really excited. I'm going to rewatch this program, which will be available on the Hammer website, so that I can actually write down all of these great titles that you've told us about, and authors and filmmakers. And for me, this program, despite the fact that climate change is incredibly depressing and species extinction, I can't even start to talk about how upsetting it is to me. But I do feel strangely inspired after tonight's program, just knowing that people like you are working on these issues and thinking about them so deeply and able to articulate them so brilliantly. And I feel very hopeful that you guys are doing a great job getting the word out, and I will continue. I'm inspired to try and do my part, and I hope that our audience is also likewise inspired to do their part and take action and remember that they have agency and that they need to utilize that agency and act. And with that,
can I ask you a question before you go?
Yes.
Is it true that the Hammer is an early voting center?
Yes, the Hammer is open for voting this Saturday, October 24th. You can vote there. You can also drop off your ballot in person there for 11 days, October 24th to November 3rd. No one will be turned away on November 3rd. So however long it takes. And I hope everyone out there is voting, voting, voting. And thank you for mentioning that. And it's just really such an honor to have all three of you at the Hammer. So thank you very, very much.
Having me.
Thank you for having us, and
Yes.
it's such a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you. It was really an honor.
All right.
Great.
Good night. Thank
Right.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.